It looks like a big warehouse, the length of a football field, in a rural area where Minnesota meets Iowa meets animal suffering. Inside are 1,000 chinchillas in conditions that would make you cringe. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, PETA's latest undercover investigation around the Molten Chinchilla Ranch, aka MCR, located in Fillmore, Minnesota. It's no ranch, it's 1,000 chinchillas held in cages with an undeniable stench of what is essentially a chinchilla hell.
We don't stay, when we're investigating, we don't stay in a facility any longer than we have to. And in an instance like this, we only stay until we develop what we think is probable cause to get officials to take action. We don't want to extend these animals' misery any longer than the person who's keeping them and who's responsible for them already has. There's no doubt, that animals are still there today who are in need of veterinary care, who are not getting it. And ultimately, even the so-called healthiest animal there is, I would argue, being held in violation of law. The Minnesota cruelty statute says you have to provide any animal who you confine in any shape or form, you have to provide that animal with quote unquote wholesome exercise. Chinchillas who are in a cubic foot of space, who cannot run, who cannot jump, who cannot climb, are, by definition, being deprived of wholesome exercise and ought to be removed from that situation, just like you would remove a dog off of a heavy chain who couldn't exercise, or just like you would remove an animal who was sick or injured and deprived of veterinary care in violation of law.
Dan Payton, PETA's Vice President of Evidence Analysis in the Cruelty Investigations Department, waited more than 2 years for the USDA to act to shut down the MCR operation. Nothing happened. Finally, a PETA undercover investigator got into MCR, and now what he saw has been turned over to law enforcement in the hopes that state and local ordinances, plus the Federal Animal Welfare Act, will be enough to save the chinchillas. In the meantime, MCR isn't the worst of it for the chinchillas. Those that survive MCR are then sold to other breeders, or to pet stores for resale, or to laboratories funded by NIH or major universities to be used in research. That's why PETA's investigation could make a difference if it means shutting down MCR, or the Molten Chinchilla Ranch, a long shed the size of a football field housing 1,000 chinchillas, the source of chinchilla misery. Here's my conversation with PETA's Dan Payton, Vice President of Evidence Analysis in the Cruelty Investigations Department, on the PETA Podcast. You've known about MCR, you've known about Dan Moulton's activity for a long time, right? What makes it special now?
Mr. Moulton's violations of the Animal Welfare Act, which established, just bare minimum standards for caring for animals, have been widely known in the animal protection community for many years. And the USDA has filed a complaint against him in fall 2018, alleging around 100 willful violations of that law. At a certain point, it became clear that we needed to take a look ourselves. PETA has investigated other chinchilla mills starting back in the 90s in Michigan. Several years ago, we actually rescued about 400 chinchillas from an operation out in California. But the Molten Chinchilla Ranch was one of the largest, clearly, in the United States. It's been a prominent supplier of these animals to laboratories for decades, and also to the pet trade. And we were just interested in taking a look for ourselves and seeing, for lack of a better phrase, what all the controversy was about.
Yeah, and so at this point, I should mention to our listening audience that those aren't chinchillas in the background. They're actually cats that you have in the office, which is fine. If we're going to be interrupted by anything, we might as well be interrupted by our animal companions.
This is true.
And so, all right, so this is such a controversy, but people have to care. In order to get this controversy to the public, people really have to care about chinchillas. Tell us, I mean, I don't know if people really know about chinchillas, except maybe they were used for coats in the past. Well, what are chinchillas? Are they look like rabbits, right? They look like...
Yeah, they look kind of like small rabbits or very, very, very large mice. They have these expressive ears, these very long tails. They're native to the Andes Mountains of Chile. And, certainly everyone can debate what species of animals, if any, should be domesticated and cared for by humanity. Chinchillas certainly are very low on the list of species who are amenable or easy to care for your typical American household. They have the densest fur of any land mammal. So they require very low temperatures, very low humidity. They have incredibly complex needs in terms of their housing. This is a species who, in their native habitat, spends their days sleeping in rocks and in caves, in essence, high up in the mountains, and at night comes out and hops around and jumps. And yet you have at Molten Chinchilla Ranch, for instance, he has them in wire-floored cages, maybe about 12 inches high. So there's no opportunities for them to jump and to exercise. There's nothing for them to burrow or hide in, which is very stressful for an animal who is a prey animal and who's surrounded by nothing but light and open wiring. And they're a nocturnal animal, right? So they're sitting there in this bright artificial light all day long for their entire so-called lives at this operation.
So these chinchillas are basically wild animals from South America. They had to be exported to the United States. So there's some kind of trade going from the wild, where their natural habitat is. They're nocturnal animals. They get them to the United States to guys like this guy, Dan Moulton. And so there's that path that how large, is there a big trade there?
Well, apparently what I've been told is that all the chinchillas today in the United States are descended from a total of 6 chinchillas who were brought into the U.S. Decades ago. Mr. Moulton himself has actually been breeding these animals for over 50 years. His father started this business back in the 60s, I believe. He does trade with other breeders in the U.S., and he does obtain chinchillas from other herds, and also, I believe, sells his chinchillas at times to other producers. And what's worrisome about that is that it has been reported, and we saw evidence of this in our investigation, that there is a prevalence of a bacterial infection in Moulton's animals. Yeah. And of course, the concern there is that if he is trading these animals with other chinchilla producers, breeders, and distributors, the risk is, of course, is that this bacteria is going to go out into other operations and spread throughout the chinchilla population of the United States.
So it's a little industry here that, like you said, started from 6 from Latin America. They come here. And chinchillas do not exist in the wild here in the United States. They all exist in this warehoused industry, right?
Right.
And we have now, if this guy started in the 60s, we have generations of chinchillas. We have essentially an American warehouse chinchilla species that has been fostered by this industry.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, he has had some of these animals. He said he's had in his hands for close to 15 years. I don't know whether I believe it or not, but I mean, 15 days in that barn is, I would argue, torture for these creatures, given that their needs, their basic needs, are just absolutely not met and ignored and outright squashed, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And yet he's had some of these animals for, going on a decade or more, he says.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but he's been doing this for 60 years, meaning that he breeds them, he sends them out to labs or schools or whatever for research. But he keeps breeding. I guess he gets the males and the females together. He breeds generations here, and it's been happening for decades. So it's a large scale facility. If you've got 1,000 chinchillas in a warehouse, and this is in Minnesota, I believe, right?
Yeah. Southern Minnesota. Yeah. He has 1,000. He actually, he has 2 old, poultry sheds on his land in his backyard, a long factory farm, low slung metal sheds. He has all 1,000 of his chinchillas in one of those barns. And he does, he keeps the females in cages, which have holes at the very top of them. And he puts metal collars around the females' necks. And the collars are just wider than the diameter of the hole on the top of the cage. And so, in effect, the females are trapped in the cages. And then the males have access to these runs over the cage's tops. And the males don't wear collars. And so the males can go down into the cages housing the females and breed. And that's how Dan continues to have this massive population, even as he's selling these animals off to laboratories and to the pet trade. And there are a few other chinchilla operations in the U.S. that have hundreds of these animals and that play similar roles in that industry to that Mr. Moulton does. But with 1,000 animals, he clearly is absolutely one of the largest in the U.S.
And so the breeding occurs in this strange way with the males and the females. And then once they're impregnated, then the females are isolated in their own cage and they have their young.
They do. They have their young. And what we found is that Moulton keeps these animals in such stressful condition in terms of lack of space and lack of privacy and lack of opportunity to get away from one another, that oftentimes the juveniles start to attack one another, or the mother, who's just so stressed by the conditions, actually attacks her offspring. And I mean, that's something that we see generally in laboratories where animals are just warehoused in such small spaces and in such desperately unnatural conditions that it's so stressful that they lash out at one another. And that was happening with the chinchillas there. We saw countless of these animals who were biting each other and wounding each other. And our investigator would bring that to Moulton's attention time and time and time again. And the answer was always, I'm going to separate those animals today. I'm going to separate those animals tomorrow. Well, the end of the day would come, the next day would come, the animals wouldn't be separated. And they would have these wounds on their ears, on the base of their tails, and other places on their body that couldn't heal because they're housed with animals who are so stressed that they continue to attack one another. And one young animal actually died after 4 weeks of our investigator bringing this animal's condition, the plight of this animal, to Moulton's attention. And he just wouldn't separate the animal. And one day, our investigator came in and the animal's carcass was on a table. And the animal was distinguished or very distinct because of the wound on the base of the tail. And it was clear that this was the animal who had been deprived of care, deprived even of the 60 seconds it would take to put that animal into another cage so that he could heal and have some space on his own. And in all likelihood, the animal's wound became infected and possibly became septic. The infection probably got into the blood, traveled throughout the body, and probably ended up, in an organ and led to the animal's death.
Now this is pretty incredible that this is valuable inventory for the owner, this guy Moulton. And when the animals are sick or injured, it doesn't seem right that there's no veterinary care or no kind of attention on wounds or broken bones or anything that might afflict if he considered them valuable, certainly you would think he would give them some kind of veterinary care.
You would think so. And I think that what that is it's a function of the number of animals he has. I mean, we've seen this before in other industries where, for instance, if you are distributing betta fish to Petco from Thailand, and you send 10,000 of those fish per week, it's really no skin off your back if 100 die in transport, because you're producing and distributing and selling these animals in such a large quantity and making so much money off the ones you actually do sell, that from your business perspective, and that's all it is to this man, is a business, your bottom line is better off not investing money in the animal's care, because you're going to be able to sell enough of these animals otherwise that, losing 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 to illness and disease every month, it's not really going to hurt you. And if you're only in it for cash, which it certainly appears that he is, then it's easy to understand. It's arguably illegal, of course, as well.
I mean, that there are provisions in the Animal Welfare Act that provide for animal care, veterinary care.
Absolutely. And he has been cited under that regulation something like 85 times since 2013 by the USDA, who, when they go to his operation over and over again, find animals with pus in their eyes, with embedded metal collars in their necks and other injuries and ailments, who Moulton himself hasn't seen, and therefore hasn't provided care to. And it was the exact same, experience that our investigator had. In fact, the USDA cited Moulton late October 2020 for 2 particular chinchillas who had eye infections, and he hadn't been aware of those animals. When that report became public in late November, our investigator saw it, went to those cage locations, found those exact chinchillas, and their eyes were sealed shut, and approached Moulton and said, "I wanted to let you know about these animals." And Moulton acted as if this was news to him, that he had no idea that those animals were in that condition. And even as late as early January, those animals were still in awful condition.
Well, it sounds like if you got 1,000 chinchillas, this isn't a one-man operation. Clearly, you had an investigator there. It just sounds like the help or the people he hires just feed the chinchillas, or what do they do? Do they do anything to help their comfort level, or are they just there to? I don't know. What do they do? It's not a one-man operation, is what I'm getting at. Is it?
It's a great question. It shouldn't be a one-man operation, but for all intents and purposes, it is. Our investigator worked there 3 days a week. On the other 4 days of every week, Mr. Moulton himself felt he was able to provide care for 1,000 animals. And our investigator asked him, how long does that take you? This is a huge number of animals. You're one man. How long does that take you? And the answer was, about 45 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And he has made that statement before publicly. And so how do you care, in quotation marks, for that many animals in 45 minutes? Well, you don't remove waste. You have these animals on wire floored cages. The waste drops down. You have an automatic manure scraping system underneath that you push a button on and it removes the animal's waste. You go through real quickly and dump a bunch of feed into their bins. You don't check the water lines. We countless times found that the water wasn't functioning. The animals were very thirsty, if not dehydrated. And where you really start to see how the lack of staffing affects the animals, other than the fact that sick and injured animals are left to languish, is that Molten doesn't provide dust baths to these animals. So these animals, the way that they groom themselves and keep themselves clean and healthy is by rolling around in volcanic ash or dust. And that's just basic chinchilla care 101. That's time intensive. That's not something that you can automate. That's something that takes labor to provide to an animal. He doesn't do that. And so a large number of his animals were matted and had disheveled coats and had chewed on themselves. And so, I'm not a chinchilla expert, but even as a layperson, I could see clear signs that these animals were neglected and were suffering and were unhappy. And when we showed this video to veterinary experts who have experience with chinchillas, who care for chinchillas and treat chinchillas, they were unanimous in condemning what was shown there, and very, very concerned, as everyone should be, for those animals.
So what we have here is a quote unquote business person who does not see it profitable to hire people to care for the chinchillas, does not consider it profitable to have veterinarians even look into the welfare or to treat the sick or injured chinchillas. And so we have essentially not even a mom and pop shop, but just a pop shop who is in control of all this. And it really is a kind of misnomer to call it a ranch, because it's just a warehouse with cages, and there's no running around to these chinchillas. They're not having a good time. It's torture. It sounds like hell from what you've described.
It really is. And honestly, the irony of it was that, some of these animals were escaping from cages. The cages are so rusted and in such poor, disrepair, from decades of use and lack of cleaning, that the animals were getting out. Well, that's, in theory, that's a violation of the Animal Welfare Act, because, these cages are supposed to house these animals and keep them safe. Frankly, I thought the lucky animals were the ones who did get out and got to walk around and got to run and hop and jump and explore. Now, they're on a concrete floor and there's not much to explore but the droppings of their peers. But, compared to all the, colleagues of theirs, so to speak, in cages, they were quite fortunate actually to get out and use those legs and have an opportunity to do something other than just crouch all day long miserably in a cage. So it's certainly not a ranch. No.
Yeah. Well, tell me about the cage. So you go into this facility. You say it's like a restructured chicken coop essentially, and you see 1,000 chinchillas in these cages. The smell of the ammonia must be just like this big cloud that hits you when you walk in.
It's overpowering, yeah. And our investigator has worked in agricultural operations, many of them, and he is quite accustomed to, the smell of a huge number of animals' waste in an unventilated, area, and what that does. And yeah, absolutely. The first few days he went in there, he talked about the fact that it would just make your eyes water and just burn your nostrils. You can feel, the fumes when you breathe in. You can feel that, going right into your respiratory tract. The windows were not open. There was not ventilation, in there whatsoever. And yeah, I mean, in a lot of respects, it looks almost like an egg laying operation.
Mm-hmm.
You've got animals packed into cages, elevated off the floor, and just being kept there until, they or their products can be sold. If you watch an investigation of a battery cage operation, where hens are being kept for eggs, yeah, in some respects, you would see, this chinchilla operation is looking, quite similar.
Yeah. And these chinchillas, this is their life. And how big are these cages? They're about, what, a foot long?
About a foot high, maybe 16 inches long, and about maybe a foot across. So, they've got a little bit more, than a cubic foot of space. And that's it. And there they are. They have a wooden block in some instances to chew on, to try to keep their teeth from overgrowing. And that's it. There's no burrowing opportunity. There's no hide. These animals are notorious for jumping and for climbing. Can't do that there because there's no second level. There's nothing to jump or climb onto. So they just sit there and suffer quietly until they die, or until he puts them on a plane and sends them off to a pet distributor in Florida, or a laboratory somewhere in the U.S. or abroad.
So if they're sent to a lab, they're there to be tested on.
Yeah.
I mean,
these animals, their ears are very expressive and very large. And so they have been used by experimenters to test various things with hearing and with ear infections. To read the papers of what's done to these animals is beyond the pale in terms of deliberately putting bacteria deep into their ear canals and then sealing it off just so that they can then drill into the animal's skulls later on and see how the bacteria affected and infected them inside, subjecting them to terribly loud noise for hours and hours on end. It's ghastly stuff. I think even for those who are familiar with and read papers like this every day, I think what's done to these very small animals in the name of pseudoscience is particularly appalling.
Well, you say pseudoscience because the science on the chinchillas or the findings on the chinchillas don't necessarily mean anything to humans, and yet that's what they try to make a connection to. And then
absolutely.
And the labs, we're talking about famous schools and research facilities, and it's been going on for decades. This is NIH is involved in this, I understand.
Our friends at NIH, the US Navy, experimenters affiliated with Harvard Medical School, Boston University, publicly funded universities, throughout the US, Colorado, Arizona State, Maryland, Minnesota, a variety of facilities in Washington. The list goes on and on.
But basically, if these facilities were able to do anything, if they stopped and said, "Oh, we don't want those 100 chinchillas," or whatever they order, it can work to shut down the molten ranch.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, our message here for the experimenters themselves is, stop experimenting on chinchillas, period. It doesn't matter whether you get them from him or some other place. You're still supporting, an industry that denies animals their basic needs, and you're also wasting, obviously, taxpayer dollars to accomplish nothing for the humans you purport to serve. But yeah, when you take away the profit motive from Mr. Moulton, and when he finds that he has fewer and fewer people calling for his animals, his motive for keeping them, I think decreases bit by bit. And we would love to transport these animals and find placement for them if he would allow that to happen. But I think that day will come. But I think the it's an uphill battle to get to that point.
So the labs are one avenue for his profits, but another avenue is to sell them to pet stores that then sell them to people. And you were just describing the situation and the circumstances under which these chinchillas live. If a pet owner or someone who's looking for an animal companion wants a pet, to get a chinchilla who's lived under these circumstances, it seems like they would be damaged psychologically if they were in these cages and biting, each other, if not themselves. They don't sound like great candidates for a domestic situation.
No. I mean, these are very complicated individuals to begin with. I mean, even the healthiest, best raised chinchilla is still a very complicated animal with very specialized needs that, a family really needs a tremendous amount of knowledge and patience and resources, financial resources, to provide for that animal's health and well-being. And one of the things that the experts we consulted with about this case said is that these animals, if they get out of this facility, these animals are going to take months and months and months of intensive care to be in a position where even an experienced chinchilla caregiver could provide a quality of life for them that's acceptable to that animal. I mean, you can't spend years in such an unnatural, cruel environment and not come out scarred, no matter who you are. Yeah. And that goes for these animals as well. They certainly could be harboring, underlying diseases and conditions that don't, jump out at you immediately. Obviously, behaviorally and psychologically, they are going to be affected by this experience, and they're going to face, some challenges in adopting to life in a home. But we sure hope and pray that, that opportunity comes for as many of them as possible.
Yeah. So we talk about this idea of being sent to a domestic situation, a research situation, and then, of course, Moulton would look at his chinchillas and say, sell them to maybe other breeders or other facilities, or do they still make, is the fur still of value these days?
Some. My understanding is that that's really on the decline, and that very, very few people are raising chinchillas purely to pelt them and to try to sell their fur. But we did find several freezers at Moulton's operation full of dead chinchillas. He would stuff them into a Ziploc bag and into a big chest freezer, and there they would go. And there were scores of them there. And his answer was that, yes, when they died, he absolutely would pelt them and, try to sell them off and wring every last dollar he could, even out of their dead bodies.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed from the investigation that you published, and it's on PETA.org, some of these chinchillas had names. Were they named by the investigator, or I can't imagine, after you describe how Moulton does his business, that Moulton actually named him and said, oh, here's little Charlene, or here's little Chloe. Right. How did the investigator come to know these animals? Just by making the rounds and seeing them when he was there?
So, our investigator, got to know them, provided names to the animals he was, most struck by. Charlene, who had a terrible injury on her left forepaw that cost her most of that limb, left her bone exposed. We had Chelsea, who had a diseased and or injured eye that protruded, where the cornea, the inside of the eye, was actually coming out, and penetrating and coming out onto the top of the globe itself. We had Chloe, who Moulton thought had likely fallen and fractured her jaw and misaligned the top and the lower jaw. And she had teeth. She had 4 very long teeth that were growing and curling up into her face. And, Moulton wasn't going to do anything about that. We actually were able to rescue her, like we did Charlene, and get her to a veterinarian. And come to find out, she actually had swallowed pieces of her teeth as they broke off. She had chunks of her teeth in her stomach. And, going back to what we were talking about earlier about how you see these animals and there are some ailments and injuries that are obvious, but you don't really know what's underlying all that. And so for that particular animal, for Chloe, when she was examined by a veterinarian, come to find out, because of the overgrown teeth, she was unable to groom herself. So on one of her back feet, she had so much feces and hair wrapped around one of her feet that one of her toes had actually become necrotic. The tissue had just died slowly due to lack of circulation. It was still attached, but it was dead. The tissue was gone. So she had to have an amputation done there. So, our investigator, in 1,000 animals, it's obviously it's difficult to lay your eyes on every single one in as detailed as a way as possible, or as you wish was possible. But he did his best to provide care for and document, the plights of those who even a layperson, with a full workday of duties ahead of them, couldn't miss.
Yeah. Well, I think the point is, though, that these animals are individual. They're noticeable. He saw them and developed if he kept seeing them over and over again because of their condition, or he made a point to see them, they could have lived exactly like other chinchillas who weren't in this factory farm situation, out in the wild or at a home as an animal companion. And it just reminds you of just how terrible these circumstances are for the other chinchillas in this so-called ranch.
There might be 975 or 980 of those animals there today, for all we know.
Yeah.
And every one of them is as interesting and unique and deserving of respect and compassion and dignity as Chelsea, is, or as Chloe was, for instance. So I was really struck watching the footage as the case developed, how clearly different each one of them was, in particularly in terms of the noises that they made. You could tell when our investigator would open up the front of the cage to visit each of these animals. I mean, you could tell how they reacted. You could tell in the noises that they made that each one of them was very unique. I mean, for lack of a better term, I don't know how else to say it. That, it was not simply, oh, here's a row of chinchillas and, the color is different here, and, this is a little bit different in that respect over here. No, every single one, the length of that shed that runs longer than a football field, was special and was different and was distinct. And every single one of them deserves everything that we and police and the USDA can get those animals.
Yeah, it's amazing. People to get a sense about this shed in the backyard. Yeah. It's not just a little shed; it's the length of a football field, like you said, which is a kind of an incredible thing to think about. That how long this was, and how it doesn't look like anything from when you look outside and say, "Oh, there's a shed." You drive by it, or can you see? Is it hidden from view, or do people drive by and say, oh, there's a shed, and they don't even think about what's going on in there?
Yeah, I have a feeling that most people in that community don't even know that he has 1,000 animals tucked out back in that shed. I mean, I think it's barely visible from the nearest county highway, but it's pretty nondescript. And there are other factory farms in that community and nearby, and I think people are accustomed to seeing those so-called barns and thinking, well, that's probably pigs or that's probably turkeys, for instance, in Minnesota. Those are the two species most commonly raised there. And yet he's got 1,000 chinchillas in his.
Yeah. And once again, just to paint a picture about what it is that the investigator saw, because sometimes you can see the video and people can go to PETA.org and see them. But sometimes it's a little too real, a little too graphic, and maybe it's just, and they want to look away because it's just too horrifying to look and see these animals have to go through this. But maybe your description might be a little easier to take. I don't know. Sure. How would you describe, again, for people who don't want to look? Because some people won't even get to the point where let's look at it and see how bad it is.
Yeah.
They just will say, okay, I don't want to look. But yeah. How would you describe it to those people?
It's animals who are deprived of everything that they deserve and that they need to be who they are. It's animals who are terrified and are stressed every minute of every day because they have nowhere to hide, and they're exposed 360 degrees on all sides, above and below. They're exposed through wire to everything that's around them, including an animal next door who they might not get along with. And so they're constantly on alert. These are prey animals who are looking around them and thinking, who's out to get me? And they have no respite from that whatsoever. There's no chance to take a breather and to hide and to be feeling something less than anxious. These animals, in essence, would be like us being kept in solitary confinement without the ability to shower, because they have no dust to bathe in. And so they can't even groom themselves. And so they feel, in addition to the stress, they just feel unwell all the time because they can't even take care of themselves. They have no chance to exercise or do the things that they need to do to be themselves. So again, make that solitary confinement that you might imagine yourself in be so small you can't even take a few steps, let alone jump, go for a walk, run, lift weights, nothing. You're just reduced to an existence, and that's it. It's not a life. It's just you're alive, but it's not a life at all. And then when you get sick, which of course you're going to in those stressful conditions where you're always run down and on edge, when you get sick or when you're kept with someone you don't get along with and you have a terrible injury, the person who's responsible for you sees you and keeps walking, or at best yanks you out by your ears or by your tail, your backside, and pries open your infected eyes with his dirty hands and guesses at what drops to put in your eyes, tries to get some in there, and then back into your cell you go. And that's it. And that is, it's not life again, but that's the reality of Molten Chinchilla Ranch. And judging by, the USDA documents, it certainly has been the reality there for many years. And unfortunately, it certainly looks like it will be, unless law enforcement and or the USDA step in and end this suffering.
So we know that there was a police raid recently.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to maybe lead to something? And also the USDA fines, although it looks like the fines are just seen as the cost of doing business by this guy.
Yeah. I think time will tell on the police. They have opened a criminal investigation. They did execute a search warrant several weeks ago, and they are investigating, and we are hopeful, of course, that they will file charges and hold him accountable in a criminal court for his failure to provide for these animals and to do right by these animals. The USDA, could confiscate the rest of the animals who are left in that barn. And we have asked them to do exactly that. They could revoke his license, and we have asked them to do that, of course, as well. The problem is that a lot of people labor under the belief that the USDA can shut an operation down, and they can revoke someone's license to operate, but that doesn't limit the number of animals they can keep. It just limits what they can do with those animals. So it would just limit him from selling them across state lines, or acting as a wholesale supplier to labs and to pet stores. But the USDA could take his license tomorrow, and he could still keep 1,000 animals in his shed, until the day he passes away if he wanted to. And there would be nothing really stopping him from doing that.
So, Dan, can PETA's investigation be used in the criminal proceedings? And I don't know, is that a possibility?
It is. We have given our evidence to the sheriff and to the county prosecutor. We have made the case, I believe, quite convincingly, that this does constitute numerous cruelty to animals offenses. Clearly, at some point, the judge agreed and said that this was probable cause to issue a search warrant. So, whether charges end up becoming filed and whether that evidence leads to a criminal matter is an open question, and depends a lot on the discretion and the judgment of individuals who hold those positions in that county. We know what the facts are. We know what the law says. Whether that is how it washes out is still up in the air.
And what county in Minnesota?
This is Fillmore County, Minnesota. It's down near the Iowa border. It's a small area. It looks like a beautiful area and a quaint area. And again, I don't think many people there know that this man has been doing this in their backyard for so many years. Ironically, he's right next to a cemetery.
Yeah.
And I think that's fitting given the number of animals he had in his freezer, lying there dead and bagged up.
Tell me, what can people who are listening to this, what can PETA supporters, our podcast listeners, what can they do? What are you suggesting they do?
Well, right now at PETA.org, we're asking individuals to contact an animal distributor who's based near Fort Myers, Florida, because that is one of Molten's most prominent recent customers. That individual in Florida has purchased at least 80 chinchillas from Molten recently for resale in the pet trade. And so we're asking, for instance, that individual to reconsider that relationship and to really think hard if, this is who he wants to do business with. We're also asking laboratories to just simply stop experimenting on these animals, not to just stop buying from Molten and then to go buy from his competitor who probably keeps animals in similarly atrocious conditions, but to realize that it's 2021 and that we don't need to be doing this to chinchillas. It's not helping us. It's obviously hurting the animals, and it's wasting money that boy, COVID-19 has taught us a lot of lessons, but one of those lessons is, this is not where funds should be going into, is to experiments on animals.
And Dan, is there anything that we can do, or people who are listening can do, to pressure the USDA or pressure the Fillmore County officials? Is that part of the action plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think good people who see these findings and can't believe that this is being allowed to continue, and that, so far nothing effective has been done legally for these animals, would be free to contact those agencies. Contacting USDA is really simple. It's just animalcare@usda.gov, and that reaches the individuals and the part of the agency that enforces the Animal Welfare Act. To their credit, USDA did file a complaint against this man, but it's been going on 2.5 years since that was filed. We all know USDA does not move as fast as PETA does, but this is an urgent matter, and this is something that's an emergency, and this needs attention now. And so I think, encouraging them to move quickly with that case, to take PETA's evidence, to get before a judge, and to enter into some kind of agreement, with this individual to wind this operation down, would be in the best interest of everyone involved.
So you used two words there. You said urgent and emergency. Does it rise to that level? Because a lot of people are just trying to get their heads around, well, what are chinchillas and how bad can it be for chinchillas? But you used the words urgent and emergency. Is it really an urgent emergency?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it is. It is. We don't stay, when we're investigating, we don't stay in a facility any longer than we have to. And in an instance like this, we only stay until we develop what we think is probable cause to get officials to take action. We don't want to extend these animals' misery any longer than the person who's keeping them and who's responsible for them already has. There's no doubt, that animals are still there today who are in need of veterinary care, who are not getting it. And ultimately, even the so-called healthiest animal there is, I would argue, being held in violation of law. The Minnesota cruelty statute says you have to provide any animal who you confine in any shape or form, you have to provide that animal with quote unquote wholesome exercise. Chinchillas who are in a cubic foot of space, who cannot run, who cannot jump, who cannot climb, are by definition being deprived of wholesome exercise and ought to be removed from that situation, just like you would remove a dog off of a heavy chain who couldn't exercise, or just like you would remove an animal who was sick or injured and deprived of veterinary care in violation of law.
Yeah. So Dan, I appreciate your time. Just for the sake of people who are computing this in their heads, and what is the cost? What does Dan Moulton sell his chinchillas to? The guy in Florida or to a lab? It must be profitable for him to keep these animals and to stay in business. But what is the cost if someone were to buy a chinchilla from Dan Moulton?
My sense is that someone could walk in there, depending on the color of the animal, and buy someone for $200 up to probably $500 or $600. I know a lot of chinchillas who are for sale in pet stores across the U.S. are $500-$600 per animal, and so, unfortunately, when people are willing to spend money on those animals and spend that much money on animals, rather than going to adopt them, from a local shelter or rescue group, you can see how it becomes plausible that it's not worth it for him to get veterinary care for every sick or injured animal who he finds in his shed.
So the officials have to take action on the PETA evidence, or people have to realize where the profit point for this guy is and try to lower it or try to bring it down so it's not profitable to do this heinous thing to to these innocent chinchillas.
Exactly right. And I think also come away with, an appreciation that, we've talked about dogs and cats for decades in this movement about how there's an overpopulation crisis and there's just no need to be bringing more of those animals into a world that already can't handle the ones who are here. And every small animal, every exotic case that we do that has connections to the pet trade just hammers that point home for a new species. And it's the same for chinchillas, just as it is for rabbits, for reptiles, for hamsters, for birds. Anyone who is sold as a companion or a so-called pet, the situation is sadly the same, and they are all being sourced from these warehouses that, can call themselves ranches, but they're sheds. They're just glorified factory farms for small animals.
Dan Payton, appreciate your time. Thanks for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you.
PETA's Dan Payton, Vice President of Evidence Analysis in the Cruelty Investigations Department. Go to PETA.org for more and take action to end the chinchilla misery at the Moulton Chinchilla Ranch in Fillmore, Minnesota. Go to PETA.org. And that's our program this time out. Thank you for listening. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, or see my work at aaldef.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.